And data scientists have been put in charge of designing and directing these police bots to remove patrons, both real people as well as other bots. And at the same time, promotion algorithms are walking around elevating and turning up the volume on the most provocative voices to keep the place interesting. Hello, and welcome to one of the most important topics in tech today. You've probably noticed that our nation, which is spilling into the rest of the world, is at a key moment for free speech, and data scientists are right in the middle of it. It really is a turning point in history, and we need to better understand our role in it. We need to be able to answer questions like, should data scientists manage free speech? And if so, how? Let me first paint the scenario that we're living in today, at least in the United States. Businesses have created platforms to host public conversations in the virtual world, but they've set standards for that discussion beyond what exists in the physical world. For example, if you walk on public or private property, you won't likely face total and constant surveillance unless you're being investigated for some reasonable cause. Manual surveillance is expensive and in some cases illegal without some reasonable cause or a warrant. But algorithmic surveillance is cheap, fast, and faces fewer legal restrictions. So imagine if all businesses began monitoring all conversations on their properties and use an automated bot to go around and remove anybody who speaks in a way that violates their standards. And imagine that there were no public spaces between the business properties and no large-scale construction company willing to help build a competitor that would have the same, unless they have the same standards and capability of producing those police bots to maintain those standards. And all of this is a response to the fact that a flood of bad and harmful information is spreading in those places faster than ever before. This is the current situation in the virtual world, and data scientists are the creators of those police bots that are supposed to wage war for the truth, and so ultimately a war over free speech. First, let's take a minute to look at the history of free speech, a war that's been waged for quite a while now, long before the digital space came into play. Justice Louis Brandeis, about 100 years ago, set the standard for interpreting free speech. In his writing on the Whitney case, he changed and progressed the argument that had originally been around since the founding of the country, which had basically been that free speech is a natural right and a virtue itself, except when it presents a clear and present danger. Brandeis' argument was that it's not merely a virtue, but it's actually a requirement for democracy to function, and that mere fear of a certain viewpoint or ideas is not sufficient for banning them. He also shifted the test for speech to be banned from the clear and present danger test to the time to answer test, basically arguing that speech in which there's enough time for a response to be given and for a counter view to be heard should be protected, even if that speech is unpopular or considered untrue or even dangerous by the majority of people. This has become the bedrock of American notion for free speech, and he had influence on other nations as well, obviously. Reactions to historic events, such as Germany's response to the Holocaust, led to much stronger regulation against the notion of free speech. After all, the dangerous ideas are shared through free speech before they ultimately gain enough power to ban free speech. Although its effectiveness in preventing violence and division is unclear, what is clear is that it's created division between public conversation and private beliefs, which can be seen in a 2019 survey in which only 18% of Germans stated that they feel safe sharing their views in public. Free speech law eventually brought up the question of how to treat internet companies. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act was passed in 1996, which says, quote, "No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider," unquote. That provides protections for companies hosting online conversations from any legal action against them for what others may choose to communicate there. It should also be noted that while the Section 230 handles the question of responsibility for what content social media companies do allow, it also grants permissions under 2A for the content that they remove. However, the internet was not the primary public square of conversation, and there were no real monopolies of the conversation at that time, beyond maybe some traditional media companies having some monopoly over what goes over the airwaves. So concerns of effectively removing content or bulk expulsion of customers was far from anybody's mind as any real concern. What's really coming to a head now is the fact that social media companies claim Section 230 protection as a neutral platform, which made sense when the content was sparse and existed with no algorithmic interference. But now their systematic moderation, promotion, and even removal efforts are making them more like publishers, and so responsible for the content that they moderate. Here's maybe a helpful analogy to think about one of the problems with this concept of publishing. Imagine that you take millions of pages of public content and train a text generation AI model to write its own articles, optimizing for the most compelling stories. And those articles are then published by the company. It's true that all the underlying information and stories and things that it was learning from weren't written by the company publishing the content, but the intensely complex management and filtering and even ordering of that information ultimately creates the meta stories that people are engaging with. So the question is whether or not the level of manipulation that companies perform today on vast swaths of information approach the content responsibilities of publishers. If so, then maybe they should be held responsible based on the degree to which they manage the content and create stories from it, even if the users are the primary sources of that content moderation. If the recent push for bills regulating social media, trying to remove the Section 230 protections, if those ultimately go through, I think that it could treat them entirely as traditional publishers, which would make them go the route of traditional publishers because they would have to ramp up moderation efforts that are much stricter because they would actually be liable for the truthfulness of that information. But they wouldn't be liable for protecting free speech or multiple viewpoints. It could mean that social media companies inevitably become more like Fox News or CNN because they are liable for determining truth, but not for rejecting it. That means that just like journalists are sifted through those companies today, the public's voice would be filtered and sifted through social media companies like those tomorrow. There have been other changes from the early internet to now, such as the fact that social media has effectively accumulated into just a few companies. And sophisticated algorithms are providing constant surveillance and virtual policing. And data scientists have been put in charge of designing and directing these police bots to remove patrons, both real people as well as other bots. And at the same time, promotion algorithms are walking around elevating and turning up the volume on the most provocative voices to keep the place interesting. The combination is powerful, and data scientists design the algorithms that manage both of those processes. And so I believe should be especially aware of that power. There are essentially two competing views for how free speech should operate on social media. One view, held by the largest companies, says that content should be moderated by a set of standards created and enforced by the business, and more specifically enforced by a combination of algorithms and content moderators. The other view, held by more of the free speech startups, says that online speech should be considered the same as speech in physical spaces, relying on the community to report content to be investigated, followed by decisions based on juries and in some cases free speech law. Although all of the internet began with the second view, including the most popular media sites today, they've all increasingly moved toward the first view in order to design the world that they would like to see. And they're rapidly progressing toward making that level of algorithmic moderation a legal requirement and have lobbied for that. The reality that disinformation spreads fast, cheap, and more anonymously means that what was feasible for physical spaces may not be equally feasible in virtual ones. In the virtual world, anonymity is easier to achieve, and scale for those who intend or believe things that are harmful, or at least considered that by the moderators. However, this comes with the assumption that no unintended or intentional harm is a threat from the moderators themselves or the data scientists that designed the algorithms. These companies have not gained trust in the public for making a lot of these decisions, especially when certain leaks have occurred, such as the 2016 claims from former content moderators who stated that Facebook intentionally weeded out conservative news stories. And when Facebook attempted to correct for this, clearing out those moderators and leaning more heavily on data scientists to further develop a purely algorithmic solution, the algorithms missed and even promoted some blatantly fake news stories from across the spectrum, because those generated the greatest responses, and machines have very little capacity for making truth judgments. In other words, machines are great at determining what works, but they're not great at determining what is true, even in areas where there's universal agreement on what is true. Trust has almost completely collapsed for millions of citizens at the start of 2021 when the sitting president, Trump, was banned from basically every social media service and even many businesses unrelated to speech because of speech that was not, it didn't necessarily directly call for, but did indirectly fuel a violent attack on the Capitol building. Facebook then mentioned that it would remove all content regarding Stop the Steal, something that tens of millions of Americans believe occurred. And perhaps even bigger news, and something that has caused bipartisan concern, was the single-day move of almost every tech company against the newer social media platform Parler, which was the most popular app at the time, especially among a lot of conservatives. But it was the most popular app in the App Store, with millions of users, $500 million evaluation, and a lot of upcoming growth that was expected. The move came in the wake of accusations that the site that was very popular with conservative voices, including ultra-far-right groups, taking advantage of some of those free speech policies, they were considered responsible for the attacks in ways that other social media sites were not. This especially in light of recent evidence that Facebook and Twitter served as perhaps the primary platforms utilized for the January 6 events, makes the motives of these companies come into question. Competition has been the trusted answer in the past to resolve problems like this, but if there are effective monopolies dominating speech platforms online and insurmountable roadblocks exist that prevent competitors from growing, the implications of these decisions to moderate speech are even more powerful. As an aside, Parler has recently announced progress toward coming back online by the end of this month, January, and so maybe there is still some competition that will lead to the creation of these platforms that do hold to a more classically liberal position on free speech. But that's something that we won't really know until we see how this policy and legislation and just practically how these businesses continue to grow or fall throughout the rest of 2021. All of these things discussed so far are just challenging from a philosophical standpoint. The challenges for data scientists are perhaps even greater. So how reasonable is it for data scientists to be tasked with building algorithms to effectively moderate speech? Again, free speech in the US was founded on the belief that without free speech, discussion is futile, that the free exchange of ideas is ultimately the best way to handle bad ideas, and that public discussion is a fundamental duty of a democratic state. So as data scientists, when we build algorithms to manage and remove speech, it is a weighty responsibility. Here are some of the current questions that we need to be able to consider. Is counter-speech still effective in the world of online echo chambers? Is there a more democratic or jury-like approach that we could take to retain a healthy level of free speech? Should we publish the decisions that we make as data scientists and moderators the way that you would have to with many rule of law decisions? A solution that might be more in line with traditional liberal free speech policy or philosophy would be to design algorithms that flag and provide alternative views as opposed to flagging and removing content entirely. except, of course, where free speech is already considered illegal because of a persistent and current violent threat. It also acknowledges that division and violence emerge not only as a result of such freedoms of speech, but also from the suppression of it. Both can lead to violence. Because once again, we need to find the right trade-offs like adults, rather than assuming that a perfect solution exists like children. There's also a massive technical challenge for data scientists. In fact, technology may not be able to resolve something as nuanced as making decisions on false or harmful speech, even if there's full agreement on the flagging decisions that should be made, which there isn't. Facebook noted a 10% error rate in 2019 for pulling down content that they would have desired to take down based on their moderators. One challenge is that intent matters. So content that is acceptable in one context may be considered unacceptable in another. And the standards that our biggest companies want to be reflected and are increasingly vague and pretty complex to flag, because they rely more on intent and perception rather than mere word usage. This is a massive struggle right now in Europe to enforce their free speech laws, such as the UK's definition for criminal speech as language that is threatening, abusive, or insulting, or is likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress. Upholding such a standard requires not only a surface-level interpretation of the words being used, but an understanding of the intent of the speaker and the interpretation of the listener, something that people struggle to do and algorithms may find impossible to do adequately. So as big tech wants to move more toward European standards for everybody, data scientists will increasingly find themselves with this impossible task. Ultimately, we need to rely more on human intervention in terms of blocking or flagging content, sorting preferences, etc. As of the year 2020, 89% of removals were performed by algorithms before being reported on Facebook. Can we really design algorithms that adequately regulate free speech? Can we accurately interpret the use of derogatory terms that in some contexts are considered free usage based on who is using it and what is the context? Not only do we have poor data for making these decisions, but we're not equipped to make such judicial calls as free of our own personal biases in the way that we see certain speech as harmful or not. So where do we go from here? My hope is that we'll find alternative ways to reduce the harm caused by speech without causing the harm that comes from removing speech. For example, I was glad to see the more recent push to flag potentially untrue news rather than completely removing it. I think there's much more opportunity to build on that flagging process by things such as adding alternative news or views to questionable content that would allow people to more easily compare these ideas with others rather than removing them. Of course, transparency and moderation decisions is also important, even if people disagree with those decisions. Things should not simply disappear without any accountability, which some claim even occurs when they send themselves a link in a private message in order to save it for later review. As data scientists, I would encourage us to have a good understanding of this topic and the trade-offs of the decisions that we're making. If we lead with blind, self-righteous zeal, we may inadvertently add fuel to the fire of public distrust, silence potentially truthful views, and build police bots that drive this country toward even deeper divisions. We have that power and that responsibility. So get informed and know what you're doing. Until next time, thank you.